Hey guys, tonight we're taking a deep dive into one of the most defining chapters of human history, the American Civil War. It's a story of division and unity, of loss and rebirth, of brother against brother, and a nation reshaped forever. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the kind of content that merges myth and mystery, that blends history with calm reflection. And hey, let us know from where you're watching and what time it is for you right now. It's time now to dim the lights, settle in, and let's cover what we have for tonight together. Long before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, long before the name Civil War was even imagined, the United States was already standing on fragile ground. The foundations of the new republic were built on ideals of liberty, freedom, and equality. But beneath those noble promises lay an unresolved contradiction that would define a century of conflict: the question of slavery. From the very birth of the United States, slavery was a wound that was both visible and unhealed. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, delegates from North and South wrestled over whether enslaved people should count toward representation in Congress. The infamous Three-Fifths Compromise was born, a moral and mathematical calculation that treated enslaved human beings as three-fifths of a person. It was not a solution, but a symptom. The founders left slavery's fate undecided, hoping future generations would deal with it peacefully. They did not. In the decades that followed, two Americas began to form under one flag. In the North, the Industrial Revolution brought factories, railroads, and growing cities. Immigrants arrived from Europe, filling labor forces, building canals, and fueling a new kind of economy based on wages and production. The North's wealth came from manufacturing, trade, and innovation. It was an economy that did not depend on slavery. But in the South, the story was different. The land was fertile, the soil rich, and the crops, especially cotton, brought immense profit. By the early 1800s, the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney transformed agriculture, making it possible to process cotton faster and more efficiently. Cotton became king, and the South became its empire. Yet, the crown of that empire rested on the backs of enslaved African Americans. Millions of men, women, and children held in bondage, their labor stolen to sustain the Southern way of life. This economic divide was more than just a difference in industry. It was a difference in worldview. To many Southerners, slavery was not just an institution, it was their foundation. They saw it as essential to their prosperity, even a moral good justified by culture, religion, and the laws of property. Meanwhile, in the North, more and more people began to view slavery as a moral evil that contradicted the very principles of the Declaration of Independence. These clashing beliefs turned into a cultural war long before the cannons roared. Politicians debated, preachers thundered from pulpits, and newspapers filled their pages with fiery editorials. In taverns, town halls, and cotton fields, Americans argued about what kind of nation they truly wanted to be. The issue was not simply moral or economic, it was political. As new states joined the Union, the question arose again and again: would they allow slavery or not? Every time America expanded westward, the debate resurfaced. Should the new lands of the Louisiana Purchase, or later the territories, gained after the Mexican-American War, be open to slavery. Every decision carried the potential to tip the balance of power between free and slave states in Congress. The Union's future hung on that balance. If one side gained too much influence, the other feared for its survival. The South worried that the North, with its growing population and industrial power, would one day dominate the federal government and threaten slavery itself. The North, on the other hand, feared that the expansion of the slavery would corrupt the nation's moral core and undermine the promise of equality that the Revolution had been fought for. By the early 19th century, a line was already being drawn, not on maps, but in hearts and minds. The North and South were developing distinct identities. The North looked toward modernization and progress, defining itself as the guardian of the Union and democracy. The South, proud and fiercely independent, defined itself through honor, land, and tradition, and slavery was at the center of it all. Even language began to differ. In the South, words like states' rights became a rallying cry. The idea that each state had the sovereign power to govern itself without interference from Washington. To them, the federal government was a distant and potentially tyrannical authority. In the North, however, many believed in the supremacy of the federal union, seeing it as the glue that held the experiment of democracy together. Every attempt at compromise seemed to only deepen the divide. Each new agreement was a fragile truce in a war of ideas. By the 1830s, the conversation about slavery was no longer confined to politics. It had become a defining feature of American life. Abolitionist societies were forming in the North, while Southern politicians were silencing dissent. In 1831, a slave rebellion led by Nat Turner in Virginia sent shockwaves through the South. Turner and his followers killed dozens of white plantation owners in an attempt to rise up against slavery. The rebellion was brutally crushed, but its legacy was lasting. Southern states responded with harsher laws, stricter control over enslaved people, and even greater fear of Northern interference. That fear was not entirely unfounded. Across the Mason-Dixon line, more and more Americans were beginning to question how a nation founded on liberty could continue to justify human bondage. Writers, ministers, and activists filled the Northern press with stories of cruelty, punishment, and separation. The gap between how Americans imagined their country and what it truly was grew wider each year. By the 1850s, political unity was fraying. The once powerful Whig Party collapsed under the weight of the slavery issue, giving rise to new movements like the Free Soil Party and eventually the Republican Party, founded on the principle of stopping the spread of slavery into the Western territories. As the decades rolled on, the seeds of division that had been planted at the nation's founding began to sprout into something dangerous. The North and South were not merely disagreeing anymore. They were evolving into two fundamentally different nations, sharing a border, but not a common purpose. And though few could have predicted it, the conflict that began as a political question, a matter of law, labor, and representation, would soon explode into one of the bloodiest wars in human history. The seeds of division had been sown deep. The soil of compromise could no longer hold them. The storm was coming, and the American landscape would never be the same again. As the young United States grew, its gaze turned steadily westward. The idea of expansion, of moving beyond the original 13 colonies, To claim the vast wilderness beyond the Appalachian Mountains was more than a goal. It was a belief, a sense of destiny. Americans of the 19th century called it manifest destiny, the conviction that their nation was chosen by Providence to spread its ideals of liberty and civilization across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But with each mile of new land, a familiar question followed close behind. Would this new territory be free, or would it permit slavery? That single question haunted every new acquisition, every treaty, and every dream of expansion. In the early 1800s, new states began to emerge from the frontier. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, all admitted as free states. Kentucky, Tennessee, and later Mississippi and Alabama, slave states. The fragile balance between the two halves of the nation had to be maintained, or the structure of Congress would tilt in favor of one side. Then came 1820, a turning point in this ongoing debate. The Missouri Territory, carved from the vast Louisiana Purchase, petitioned for statehood. The problem was simple and dangerous. Missouri wanted to join the Union as a slave state. At the time, there was an even number of free and slave states, 11 of each, and Missouri's entry would upset that equilibrium. The argument spread through the halls of Congress like wildfire. Northern representatives feared that allowing Missouri to enter as a slave state would give the South a permanent majority in the Senate. Southerners countered that restricting slavery's expansion violated their rights and threatened their way of life. For months, the debate raged. Finally, after bitter negotiation, Congress reached what it called a compromise. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, and Maine, which separated from Massachusetts, would enter as a free state, restoring balance. But more importantly, Congress drew a line across the map at latitude 30 north. Slavery would be prohibited in all new territories north of that line and permitted to the south. It became known as the Missouri Compromise, a fragile peace drawn not with understanding, but with geography. For a time it held. Yet, beneath the surface, both sides understood that this was not a solution. It was a temporary patch over a deep national wound. As the decades passed, America's hunger for land only grew. The Mexican-American War in the 1840s brought vast new territories under U.S. control. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and others. The victory was celebrated, but it reignited the debate with greater intensity than ever before. Would these new lands, stretching across deserts and mountains to the Pacific Ocean, allow slavery? In 1846, Congressman David Wilmot proposed a measure known as the Wilmot Proviso. It stated that any territory acquired from Mexico should be free from slavery. It passed in the House of Representatives, dominated by the North, but failed in the Senate, where Southern power held firm. The Wilmot Proviso never became law, but its spirit lingered, deepening the divisions between North and South. By 1850, the crisis returned to the center of American politics. California, bursting with settlers from the gold rush, petitioned for statehood as a free state. Once again, the balance was at stake. Southern leaders threatened secession, declaring that any restriction on slavery's expansion was an attack on their constitutional rights. This led to the Compromise of 1850, another delicate attempt to maintain unity. California entered the Union as a free state, but in return, the South received a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, compelling citizens in free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. The slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C., but slavery itself remained legal there. The compromise was an intricate web of concessions, and like all the ones before it, it only delayed the inevitable. The new fugitive slave law was among the most controversial pieces of legislation ever passed in America. It turned the issue of slavery from a distant political problem into a personal moral dilemma for ordinary Northerners. Now, even in states where slavery was outlawed, citizens could be forced to participate in its enforcement. Federal marshals could enter northern towns to seize fugitives, and heavy penalties awaited anyone who dared to help them. The result was outrage. Abolitionists denounced the law as tyranny. Escaped slaves who had built lives in the North now lived in fear of being captured and returned. The Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses, grew more active than ever, guided by figures like Harriet Tubman, who risked her life repeatedly to lead enslaved people to freedom. While tensions grew in the North, in the South, anger and defensiveness hardened into ideology. Many Southern politicians began to frame slavery not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good. They argued that African Americans were unfit for freedom, that slavery provided order and civilization, and that the North was hypocritical, profiting from Southern cotton while condemning the system that made it possible. Every debate in Congress, every speech on the floor seemed to pull the Union closer to breaking point. The Senate itself became a stage for confrontation. One of the most infamous incidents came in 1856, when Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, an outspoken abolitionist, delivered a fiery speech attacking the spread of slavery. Days later, he was beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor by Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina, who used his cane as a weapon. The nation was horrified. But in the South, Brooks was celebrated as a hero. If compromise had once been the heartbeat of American politics, by now it was gasping for breath. The middle ground was disappearing, replaced by resentment, suspicion, and anger. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act reopened the old wounds of the Missouri Compromise. It declared that the people of new territories could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery through a principle called popular sovereignty. But instead of resolving the issue democratically, it invited chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each determined to sway the outcome. The territory erupted into violence, and bleeding Kansas became a symbol of a nation tearing itself apart. Each expansion westward, each law passed, and each territory claimed became another test the Union barely survived. The dream of manifest destiny, once a proud vision of unity and progress, had become a nightmare of moral contradiction. The land was vast, but the space between Americans was shrinking. The debate was no longer about where slavery could go. It was about whether the Union could exist at all while half of it was free and half enslaved. The westward expansion that had promised opportunity and freedom had instead revealed a bitter truth, that the question of slavery was not confined to the past, but embedded in the future of the nation itself. The great debate was not ending. It was evolving into something far more dangerous. By the middle of the 19th century, America was not only divided by geography and economy, it was divided by conscience. The question of slavery, once treated as a political inconvenience, had become the central moral crisis of a nation that claimed to stand for freedom. From this tension, a movement rose that would challenge the very foundations of the American system, the abolitionist movement. The rise of abolitionism did not happen overnight. It began quietly, with voices that refused to stay silent. As early as the 18th century, Quakers had condemned slavery as incompatible with Christianity. They spoke of the equal worth of all souls before God and refused to own slaves themselves. Their message, though dismissed by many at the time, planted early seeds of dissent that would later grow into a nationwide crusade. By the early 1800s, as the North industrialized and literacy spread, those seeds began to bloom. Pamphlets, sermons, and editorials started circulating through towns and cities, calling slavery not merely a political issue, but a sin, an abomination in the eyes of God and humanity. Religious revivals during the Second Great Awakening amplified these voices. Preachers thundered from pulpits that no nation could call itself righteous while millions lived in bondage. One of the first organized groups to take action was the American Anti-Slavery Society, founded in 1833 by a fiery writer and reformer named William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison was uncompromising. Through his newspaper, The Liberator, he declared that he would not retreat, that he would not moderate his language, and that he would be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. His words were bold and often shocking, but they captured something many Americans were feeling, that slavery was not just a stain on the nation, it was its great hypocrisy. Garrison's passion ignited a new kind of movement, one that was loud, public, and impossible to ignore. Abolitionists began to hold conventions, deliver lectures, and petition Congress. Some of them believed in peaceful persuasion, others in more direct action. The movement was not unified in method, but it was united in purpose to end slavery everywhere it existed. And among those voices was one that carried the unique weight of experience, that of Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery in Maryland around 1818, Douglass escaped to freedom and became one of the most eloquent and powerful orators in American history. His speeches captivated audiences across the North and Europe. He spoke not as an observer, but as a witness. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, revealed the brutality of slavery in unflinching detail. Douglass understood both the human and political dimensions of the struggle. He argued that slavery was not only an injustice to the enslaved, but a corruption of democracy itself. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? He famously asked, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. His words struck the conscience of the North and challenged its comfort. As the movement gained strength, others joined the fight in their own ways. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a writer and mother of 7, penned a novel that would forever alter the conversation. Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, told the story of enslaved families torn apart by cruelty and greed. Stowe's book did what political speeches and legal arguments could not. It humanized the enslaved. It made readers weep, rage, and question their society. Within a year, it sold hundreds of thousands of copies. In the North, It became a call to conscience. In the South, it was condemned as slander and lies. When Stowe later met President Abraham Lincoln, he reportedly greeted her by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Whether he truly said those words or not, the sentiment reflected a reality. Ideas could be more powerful than armies. Beyond speeches and books, abolitionism took many forms. There were secret networks and safe houses known collectively as the Underground Railroad, where ordinary people risked everything to help enslaved individuals escape to freedom in the North or across the border into Canada. Harriet Tubman became one of its most legendary figures. Born into slavery in Maryland, she escaped in 1849, but returned again and again, more than a dozen times, to rescue others. Her courage and tactical genius earned her the nickname Moses. By the time the war began, she had guided over 70 people to freedom, all without being captured. Tubman's actions embodied a truth that frightened the South, that the institution of slavery could be resisted from within, and that the moral authority of the abolitionists was growing stronger by the day. Yet, while abolitionism burned brightly in the North, it was met with fury and fear in the South. Southern politicians and newspapers painted abolitionists as dangerous radicals, fanatics bent on destroying their society. In some Southern states, it became a crime to distribute anti-slavery literature. Vigilante mobs attacked abolitionist speakers, destroyed printing presses, and threatened those who dared to question slavery's legitimacy. Even in the North, the abolitionists were not universally embraced. Many Northern merchants and industrialists had financial ties to Southern cotton. They saw the movement as a threat to the economy. Others, though opposed to slavery, feared that freeing millions of African Americans would disrupt society or flood labor markets. The movement, while morally powerful, often stood against both political and popular resistance. Despite these challenges, the abolitionists understood something profound: that moral progress must rarely begins with majority approval. They believed that truth must be spoken even when inconvenient, even when dangerous. As the 1850s unfolded, the abolitionist cause became intertwined with politics. The old parties, Whigs and Democrats, fractured under the pressure. Out of the chaos rose a new political force, the Republican Party, founded on the principle of halting the expansion of slavery. Though not all Republicans were abolitionists, the movement's influence shaped their platform and gave their cause moral urgency. At the same time, events in the courts inflamed passions further. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. For abolitionists, it was proof that the nation's legal system had become an accomplice to injustice. For the South, it was vindication. The abolitionists did not back down. They intensified their efforts, their voices echoing through pulpits, newspapers, and lecture halls. And among them rose a man who would take their message from words to action: John Brown. Brown believed that slavery was not only evil, but that it could be destroyed only through force. In 1859, he led a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, intending to ignite a slave uprising. The raid failed, and Brown was captured, tried, and executed. Yet his final words, that the crimes of the nation could not be purged but with blood, echoed like prophecy. By the dawn of the 1860s, abolitionism had transformed America's moral landscape. What began as a small chorus of dissent had become a thunderous demand for justice. The abolitionists had shifted the question forever, from whether slavery was practical to whether it was right, and in that transformation lay the heart of the coming storm. For once, a nation begins to see its injustice clearly. It cannot unsee it. The call for freedom had become louder than the voice of compromise. By 1850, the United States stood at a crossroads. The Mexican-American War had ended only 2 years earlier, and with it came a stunning expansion of territory. Lands stretching from Texas to California, deserts and mountains and river valleys that seemed to promise limitless opportunity. But each new mile of soil forced the same old question. Would it be free or would it be slave? Gold had been discovered in California in 1848, and within months, thousands of prospectors poured westward. By 1849, the territory's population had exploded, and it applied for statehood as a free state. To Northerners, California's admission seemed the natural result of free labor and open opportunity. To Southerners, it felt like the walls were closing in. 11 slave states and 11 free states had maintained a delicate balance in the Senate for decades. Adding California as a free state would give the North a clear majority, threatening the political power the South depended upon to protect slavery. The debate that followed in Congress stretched for months and nearly tore the Union apart. At its center stood a handful of legendary figures, men whose names were already etched into the nation's story. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, was now an aging statesman, determined to find yet another middle ground between North and South. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts urged unity above all else, pleading that the preservation of the Union was worth any concession. And standing against them, fiery and defiant, was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who insisted that the South's rights were being trampled and that secession might be the only answer. The result of their struggle was a bundle of 5 bills known collectively as the Compromise of 1850. Together, they sought to soothe both regions, to buy time for peace, though in truth, they only postponed the inevitable. California would enter the Union as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah would be organized without immediate restrictions on slavery. Instead, the people there would decide for themselves when applying for statehood. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be abolished in the District of Columbia. In exchange, the South gained a new weapon, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a law that would soon turn the entire North into contested ground. The Fugitive Slave Act struck at the heart of the abolitionist North. It required ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, even police, to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. Federal commissioners received payment for each fugitive returned, giving them incentive to side with slave catchers. Accused runaways could not testify in their own defense, and those who helped them faced steep fines and prison time. In effect, slavery's reach now extended into free states. No black person, free or escaped, was truly safe. The Fugitive Slave Act transformed the moral landscape of the North almost overnight. Suddenly, the issue of slavery was not a distant tragedy confined to the cotton fields of the South. It was on the streets of Boston, in the markets of Philadelphia, And at the docks of New York, federal marshals marched through free cities in pursuit of human beings who had already crossed the line to freedom. In some towns, people awoke to find wanted posters nailed to lampposts, offering cash rewards for the capture of escaped men and women whose only crime was the desire to live free. Newspapers carried chilling accounts of families torn apart, of children ripped from their parents' arms. Even those who had never thought deeply about the issue were forced to confront it. The moral distance between North and South collapsed. The law's enforcement sparked outrage, and resistance quickly followed. Entire communities began to organize what became known as vigilance committees, networks of abolitionists, free blacks, and sympathetic whites who pledged to defy the Fugitive Slave Act at every turn. They warned fugitives of approaching patrols, raised money for legal defense, and when necessary, stood between federal marshals and their captives. Underground railroad activity surged. Houses in quiet northern towns became stations on the route to Canada, where American laws could not reach. Harriet Tubman, already legendary for her courage, intensified her missions. She guided dozens more to freedom, evading bounty hunters and patrollers under cover of night. Her exploits became whispered stories of defiance and hope, spreading across both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. The South saw these acts as lawlessness, proof that the North had no respect for Southern rights or the Constitution. The North saw the law itself as tyranny. Each arrest, each trial, became a public spectacle that deepened the nation's polarization. The Dred Scott decision also had profound implications for African Americans, both free and enslaved. By ruling that African Americans could never be citizens, the Supreme Court effectively denied millions of people the protection of the law. Free black communities in the North, who had long considered themselves citizens with rights and protections, suddenly faced uncertainty and vulnerability. The decision created a chilling effect, reinforcing the social and legal barriers that prevented African Americans from participating fully in civic life. Moreover, the ruling intensified sectional tensions by framing slavery as a question of property rights rather than human rights. Taney and the majority opinion emphasized that enslaved individuals were property and that the Constitution protected the property rights of slaveholders. This legal framing stripped the debate of moral nuance, turning the question of slavery into a purely political and economic issue. For Northerners who viewed slavery as a moral evil, the decision felt like a national betrayal. The ruling's timing could not have been worse. The Kansas-Nebraska crisis was still fresh in the public mind, and the violence of Bleeding Kansas had already demonstrated that sectional disputes could quickly turn deadly. The Dred Scott decision removed the possibility of compromise, undermining the fragile political arrangements that had temporarily held the Union together. By effectively sanctioning slavery in all territories, it made the looming confrontation between North and South unavoidable. In the years that followed, the Dred Scott decision became a touchstone for debates about slavery, citizenship, and federal power. Abraham Lincoln repeatedly referenced it in speeches, warning that the court had placed the nation on a dangerous path. Southern leaders, conversely, cited it as justification for defending their way of life. Across the country, the ruling fueled passion, anger, and fear. laying the groundwork for the election of 1860 and the eventual secession of Southern states. Ultimately, the Dred Scott decision did more than deny freedom to one man. It accelerated the nation toward civil war by placing the full weight of the Supreme Court behind the interests of the slaveholding South. It made compromise less likely and confrontation more inevitable. The ruling exposed the limits of the political system and highlighted the moral and legal contradictions that had been building since the nation's founding. For historians, the Dred Scott case stands as a grim reminder of how law can be used to reinforce injustice. For the country at the time, it was a spark that lit the tinder of sectional tension. Americans could no longer ignore the central moral and political question: could a nation that claimed to stand for liberty survive while denying freedom to millions of its inhabitants? The answer, in the end, would not come from the Supreme Court. It would come from the battlefield. By 1860, the United States was teetering on the edge of collapse. The Dred Scott decision had exposed the limits of compromise and deepened sectional divisions, while the violence of Bleeding Kansas had proven that moral and political disagreements over slavery could easily erupt into bloodshed. Amid this turbulence, the presidential election of 1860 emerged as a pivotal moment, a test of whether the Union could survive under its existing political structures, or whether the nation would fracture irreparably. The political landscape in 1860 was fractured, reflecting the country's sectional tensions. The Democratic Party, long one of the pillars of American politics, had split into Northern and Southern factions over the issue of slavery. Northern Democrats, led by Stephen A. Douglas, advocated for popular sovereignty, the idea that individual territories should decide whether to allow slavery. Southern Democrats, however, demanded federal protection for slavery in all territories. The division effectively guaranteed that no Democratic candidate could secure a majority of both Northern and Southern votes. Amid this chaos, a new political force rose: the Republican Party. Founded in the mid-1850s, the party opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, but did not yet advocate immediate abolition in states where slavery already existed. It attracted former Whigs, Free Soilers, abolitionists, and Northern industrialists who believed that slavery threatened the moral and economic future of the country. The Republicans sought to unite a diverse coalition around the principle that the United States should remain a land of free labor and free men, where opportunity was not dictated by human bondage. At the center of the Republican ticket was Abraham Lincoln, a relatively obscure figure on the national stage. Born in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1809, Lincoln had risen from humble beginnings, educated himself, and built a career as a lawyer and politician in Illinois. Known for his honesty, thoughtfulness, and political skill, Lincoln had previously served a single term in Congress and earned national attention for his debates with Stephen Douglas during the Illinois Senate race in 1858. Though he lost that Senate race, the debates had positioned him as a principled and eloquent opponent of slavery's expansions, someone who could articulate the fears and aspirations of millions of Northerners. Lincoln's message was carefully crafted. He emphasized that the Union must be preserved and that slavery could not spread into new territories, framing the issue as both a moral and political concern. He avoided extreme rhetoric, recognizing that the South's reaction could be volatile. Yet his opponents painted him as a radical abolitionist who sought to abolish slavery everywhere, a misrepresentation designed to inflame fear in the Southern states. The 1860 election featured four major candidates: Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans, Stephen A. Douglas for the Northern Democrats, John C. Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and John Bell for the Constitutional Union Party, which sought to preserve the Union without taking a strong stance on slavery. The division of the Democratic Party and the existence of a fourth party meant that the Republican candidate had a unique opportunity to win the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. Lincoln's campaign focused on building a broad coalition in the North, appealing to voters who were concerned about the moral and economic implications of slavery. He was aided by an increasingly organized Republican Party infrastructure, which mobilized volunteers, printed newspapers, and coordinated rallies across multiple states. Lincoln's speeches were direct, logical, and imbued with moral weight. He argued that the United States could not continue to expand slavery into new lands without imperiling the nation itself. On November 6, 1860, the results came in. Abraham Lincoln had won a decisive victory, a sweeping triumph in the North, carrying nearly every free state. Yet he had received no votes from the Deep South, and his name did not even appear on many Southern ballots. To Southerners, his election was a signal. The federal government would now be dominated by those who opposed the expansion of slavery. The South interpreted this as an existential threat to their economic and social system, and panic quickly spread across the region. South Carolina was the first to act. On December 20th, 1860, its legislature voted unanimously to secede from the Union. The state cited Lincoln's election as proof that the North would not respect Southern rights, especially the right to maintain and expand slavery. Other Southern states quickly followed. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all seceded within months. By early 1861, the Confederate States of America had been formed, with Jefferson Davis as its president and a constitution explicitly protecting the institution of slavery. Lincoln faced a crisis unlike any the nation had seen. Although he was committed to preserving the Union, he had to navigate the delicate task of responding to secession without provoking immediate war. His election had triggered the ultimate test of federal authority. Could a president govern a nation where half of it no longer recognized his legitimacy? The election of Abraham Lincoln, therefore, was not just a political contest. It was a moral, ideological, and existential turning point. It demonstrated that the United States could no longer rely on compromise alone to manage the sectional divide. It made clear that the nation's differences were irreconcilable within the old political framework, and that confrontation, rather than negotiation, was becoming inevitable. For historians, Lincoln's election represents a masterclass in political strategy and timing. For the nation at the time, it was a lightning rod, igniting passions, fears, and ultimately the first steps toward war. Lincoln's victory, viewed through the lens of the South, was a threat to their economic interests and social order. Through the North, it was a promise of moral clarity and the potential to halt slavery's expansion. The stage was now fully set. The seceded Southern states were forming their own government, stockpiling arms, and taking control of federal installations within their borders. The Union, under Lincoln's leadership, was faced with unprecedented challenges to preserve the Constitution, maintain federal authority, and prevent a disintegration that could have permanently altered the map of North America. The 1860 election proved that politics alone could no longer contain the nation's divisions. It was a moment when words, votes, and ideas collided with geography, economics, and identity. The United States had reached the point of no return. The election of Abraham Lincoln was the spark. What came next would be a conflagration unlike anything in the country's history. The Civil War, the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 sent shockwaves across the United States. But the shock was only the beginning. Within weeks, the fragile fabric of the Union began to tear as the Southern states, convinced that their way of life and economic system were under existential threat, moved decisively toward secession. The nation, once united under a single constitution, now faced the terrifying prospect of division. With the stage set for an unprecedented conflict, South Carolina, the first state to act, called a special convention shortly after Lincoln's election. On December 20th, 1860, the delegates voted unanimously to secede from the Union, declaring that the federal government had violated the constitutional rights of Southern states by allowing a president hostile to slavery to take office. Their declaration cited the grievous wrongs imposed upon them and claimed that their secession was necessary to protect their property, culture, and sovereignty. This action was a bold statement. Secession was no longer a theoretical threat. It had become a tangible reality. The reaction across the South was swift. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed South Carolina's lead, forming a coalition of seceding states committed to preserving slavery and asserting their independence. These states would soon come together to create the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis inaugurated as president in February 1861. Their new constitution mirrored the U.S. Constitution in many ways, but with explicit protections for slavery and the sovereignty of states, making clear that the Confederacy's foundation rested on the institution of human bondage. The creation of the Confederacy threw the nation into crisis. For the North, the secession of these states was a direct challenge to federal authority and the principles of the Constitution. For the South, Lincoln's election and the refusal of the federal government to guarantee the protection of slavery represented an existential threat. Each side viewed the other's actions as an attack on its way of life, making compromise increasingly unlikely. During this tense period, the nation watched as the first cracks appeared in federal control over key installations in the South. Forts, arsenals, and military posts located in seceded states became flashpoints. Some were surrendered without bloodshed, others were fortified in anticipation of conflict. Among the most critical was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Though still under Union control, it was surrounded by a secessionist state and a growing Confederate militia. Its fate would soon determine whether the Union could avoid war or whether the nation would descend into armed conflict. Political leaders in the North, including President-elect Lincoln, faced a delicate balance. Lincoln had to reassure the border states that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, while simultaneously signaling to the South that the Union would not dissolve. His inaugural address in March 1861 carefully navigated this tension. Lincoln emphasized that he had no intention of immediately abolishing slavery in the states where it was legal, but he also warned that the Union was perpetual and could not be lawfully broken. His words were both conciliatory and firm, a message meant to prevent war while maintaining authority. Yet, despite these efforts, the momentum toward conflict continued to build. Southern militias began seizing federal property, collecting arms, and organizing for defense. Ports were closed to federal ships, customs offices were taken over, and Confederate flags began to fly over formerly Union-controlled territories. In essence, the Southern states were establishing the infrastructure of a new nation even before the ink had dried on their secession declarations. In the border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, tensions were especially acute. These states contained divided populations and strategic locations critical to the Union's security. Lincoln understood that if these states chose to join the Confederacy, the Union would be geographically and militarily vulnerable. To secure them, he had to employ both political negotiation and, at times, military pressure, ensuring that the Union remained viable while avoiding further provocation. Public opinion during this period was polarized and volatile. Newspapers, speeches, and pamphlets inflamed passions in both regions. In the North, citizens feared the expansion of slavery and the challenge to federal authority. In the South, there was a widespread belief that the North would eventually attempt to abolish slavery altogether, leaving the Southern states economically and socially vulnerable. Each side interpreted the other's actions as aggressive and threatening, creating a feedback loop of mistrust and hostility. By April 1861, the nation was a powder keg. Fort Sumter, the symbol of federal authority in the heart of the secessionist South, had become the focus of tension. Confederate forces demanded its surrender, while Lincoln, determined to maintain federal control, prepared to send provisions and reinforcements. Neither side sought open war initially, but the situation had become highly combustible. A single misstep could ignite a conflict that would engulf the continent. The secession of Southern states, combined with the creation of the Confederacy and the strategic confrontations over federal forts, marked the definitive division of the United States. What had been a union of states with deep ideological differences was now a nation physically and politically fractured. The very idea of compromise had eroded under the weight of entrenched positions, moral convictions, and economic imperatives. The North and South were no longer simply two regions with conflicting interests. They were two nations on a collision course. In retrospect, this period reveals the complexity of national loyalty, constitutional interpretation, and human ambition. Leaders on both sides struggled to navigate unprecedented challenges. Ordinary citizens grappled with uncertainty and fear, unsure of whether war was imminent or whether reconciliation was still possible. The decisions made in these months would determine not only the fate of slavery, but the survival of the United States itself. The nation's division was complete, but the coming conflict would test more than political alliances. It would challenge the ideals, endurance, and conscience of every American. With the secession of Southern states and the establishment of the Confederacy, the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between two visions of America, one committed to preserving slavery, the other determined to uphold the Union. The first shots were only a heartbeat away. By April 1861, the United States stood on the brink of an unimaginable conflict. 7 southern states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, while 4 critical border states teetered uncertainly between loyalty and rebellion. The focus of tension had narrowed to one strategic symbol: Fort Sumter, a Union garrison located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Its significance was both practical and symbolic. To hold Fort Sumter was to assert federal authority in the heart of the Confederacy. To surrender it would be to acknowledge the legitimacy of secession. For weeks, both sides maneuvered carefully. Confederate forces, under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard, demanded that the fort be surrendered peacefully. Union Major Robert Anderson, aware that his small garrison was surrounded and outnumbered, prepared to hold out, but also recognized the danger of escalating the situation into open conflict. Meanwhile, President Abraham Lincoln, newly inaugurated and acutely aware of the fragile Union, sought to navigate a path between firmness and restraint. He dispatched a small supply convoy to Fort Sumter, signaling his intent to maintain federal presence without provoking violence. The situation, however, was a tinderbox. On the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, bombarding it with artillery from the surrounding harbor defenses. The attack was swift and unrelenting, signaling the start of a war that no American alive at the time could fully comprehend. Anderson's garrison returned fire sporadically, but was vastly outmatched. After 34 hours of continuous bombardment, with no fatalities but substantial structural damage, Anderson surrendered the fort. The news of the attack on Fort Sumter electrified the nation. In the North, it was perceived as an act of rebellion, a violent challenge to the authority of the federal government. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the insurrection and preserve the Union, setting in motion a massive mobilization unprecedented in American history. Northern newspapers rallied public opinion, framing the conflict as a defense of the Constitution, the rule of law, and the very idea of national unity. The 1860 election proved that politics alone could no longer contain the nation's divisions. It was a moment when words, votes, and ideas collided with geography, economics, and identity. The United States had reached the point of no return. The election of Abraham Lincoln was the spark. What came next would be a conflagration unlike anything in the country's history. The Civil War, the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 sent shockwaves across the United States. But the shock was only the beginning. Within weeks, the fragile fabric of the Union began to tear as the southern states, convinced that their way of life and economic system were under existential threat, moved decisively toward secession. The nation, once united under a single constitution, now faced the terrifying prospect of division. With the stage set for an unprecedented conflict, South Carolina, the first state to act, called a special convention shortly after Lincoln's election. On December 20th, 1860, the delegates voted unanimously to secede from the Union, declaring that the federal government had violated the constitutional rights of southern states by allowing a president hostile to slavery to take office. Their declaration cited the grievous wrongs imposed upon them and claimed that their secession was necessary to protect their property, culture, and sovereignty. This action was a bold statement. Secession was no longer a theoretical threat. It had become a tangible reality. The reaction across the South was swift. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed South Carolina's lead, forming a coalition of seceding states committed to preserving slavery and asserting their independence. These states would soon come together to create the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis inaugurated as president in February 1861. Their new constitution mirrored the U.S. Constitution in many ways, but with explicit protections for slavery and the sovereignty of states, making clear that the Confederacy's foundation rested on the institution of human bondage. The creation of the Confederacy threw the nation into crisis. For the North, the secession of these states was a direct challenge to federal authority and the principles of the Constitution. For the South, Lincoln's election and the refusal of the federal government to guarantee the protection of slavery represented an existential threat. Each side viewed the other's actions as an attack on its way of life, making compromise increasingly unlikely. During this tense period, the nation watched as the first cracks appeared in federal control over key installations in the South. Forts, arsenals, and military posts located in seceded states became flashpoints. Some were surrendered without bloodshed, others were fortified in anticipation of conflict. Among the most critical was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Though still under Union control, it was surrounded by a secessionist state and a growing Confederate militia. Its fate would soon determine whether the Union could avoid war or whether the nation would descend into armed conflict. Political leaders in the North, including President-elect Lincoln, faced a delicate balance. Lincoln had to reassure the border states that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, while simultaneously signaling to the South that the Union would not dissolve. His inaugural address in March 1861 carefully navigated this tension. Lincoln emphasized that he had no intention of immediately abolishing slavery in the states where it was legal, but he also warned that the Union was perpetual and could not be lawfully broken. His words were both conciliatory and firm, a message meant to prevent war while maintaining authority. Yet, despite these efforts, the momentum toward conflict continued to build. Southern militias began seizing federal property, collecting arms, and organizing for defense. Ports were closed to federal ships, customs offices were taken over, and Confederate flags began to fly over formerly Union-controlled territories. In essence, the Southern states were establishing the infrastructure of a new nation even before the ink had dried on their secession declarations. In the border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, tensions were especially acute. These states contained divided populations and strategic locations critical to the Union's security. Lincoln understood that if these states chose to join the Confederacy, the Union would be geographically and militarily vulnerable. To secure them, he had to employ both political negotiation and, at times, military pressure, ensuring that the Union remained viable while avoiding further provocation. Public opinion during this period was polarized and volatile. Newspapers, speeches, and pamphlets inflamed passions in both regions. In the North, citizens feared the expansion of slavery and the challenge to federal authority. In the South, there was a widespread belief that the North would eventually attempt to abolish slavery altogether, leaving the Southern states economically and socially vulnerable. Each side interpreted the other's actions as aggressive and threatening, creating a feedback loop of mistrust and hostility. By April 1861, the nation was a powder keg. Fort Sumter, the symbol of federal authority in the heart of the secessionist South, had become the focus of tension. Confederate forces demanded its surrender, while Lincoln, determined to maintain federal control, prepared to send provisions and reinforcements. Neither side sought open war initially, but the situation had become highly combustible. A single misstep could ignite a conflict that would engulf the continent. The secession of Southern states, combined with the creation of the Confederacy and the strategic confrontations over federal forts, marked the definitive division of the United States. What had been a union of states with deep ideological differences was now a nation physically and politically fractured. The very idea of compromise had eroded under the weight of entrenched positions, moral convictions, and economic imperatives. The North and South were no longer simply two regions with conflicting interests. They were two nations on a collision course. In retrospect, this period reveals the complexity of national loyalty, constitutional interpretation, and human ambition. Leaders on both sides struggled to navigate unprecedented challenges. Ordinary citizens grappled with uncertainty and fear, unsure of whether war was imminent or whether reconciliation was still possible. The decisions made in these months would determine not only the fate of slavery, but the survival of the United States itself. The nation's division was complete, but the coming conflict would test more than political alliances. It would challenge the ideals, endurance, and conscience of every American. With the secession of Southern states and the establishment of the Confederacy, the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between two visions of America, one committed to preserving slavery, the other determined to uphold the Union. The first shots were only a heartbeat away. By April 1861, the United States stood on the brink of an unimaginable conflict. 7 Southern states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, while 4 critical border states teetered uncertainly between loyalty and rebellion. The focus of tension had narrowed to one strategic symbol: Fort Sumter, a Union garrison located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Its significance was both practical and symbolic. To hold Fort Sumter was to assert federal authority in the heart of the Confederacy. To surrender it would be to acknowledge the legitimacy of secession. For weeks, both sides maneuvered carefully. Confederate forces, under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard, demanded that the fort be surrendered peacefully. Union Major Robert Anderson, aware that his small garrison was surrounded and outnumbered, prepared to hold out, but also recognized the danger of escalating the situation into open conflict. Meanwhile, President Abraham Lincoln, newly inaugurated and acutely aware of the fragile Union, sought to navigate a path between firmness and restraint. He dispatched a small supply convoy to Fort Sumter, signaling his intent to maintain federal presence without provoking violence. The situation, however, was a tinderbox. On the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, bombarding it with artillery from the surrounding harbor defenses. The attack was swift and unrelenting, signaling the start of a war that no American alive at the time could fully comprehend. Anderson's garrison returned fire sporadically, but was vastly outmatched. After 34 hours of continuous bombardment, with no fatalities but substantial structural damage, Anderson surrendered the fort. The news of the attack on Fort Sumter electrified the nation. In the North, it was perceived as an act of rebellion, a violent challenge to the authority of the federal government. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the insurrection and preserve the Union, setting in motion a massive mobilization unprecedented in American history. Northern newspapers rallied public opinion, framing the conflict as a defense of the Constitution, the rule of law, and the very idea of national unity. In the South, the capture of Fort Sumter was a cause for celebration and a powerful symbol of the Confederacy's resolve. The successful siege demonstrated that secession was not merely a theoretical concept, but a reality backed by organized military force. It also emboldened additional Southern states that had not yet seceded. Within days, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederacy, bringing the total to 11 states and formally dividing the nation into two hostile camps. The attack on Fort Sumter marked more than a military engagement. It represented a profound moral and psychological turning point. The United States, a nation that had prided itself on compromise and democracy, was now engaged in a war that would test its identity, values, and resilience. Americans on both sides understood that the stakes were nothing less than the survival of their respective visions for the country. For the soldiers at Fort Sumter, the battle was both terrifying and surreal. They faced bombardment from artillery they could barely counter, uncertain whether reinforcements would arrive or if surrender would be inevitable. Civilians watching from Charleston Harbor and from northern cities followed the siege anxiously, reading every telegram and newspaper dispatch. The bombardment's psychological impact was immense. It was not just an attack on a fort, but an attack on the idea of a unified nation. Following Fort Sumter, Lincoln's call for volunteers transformed the political landscape. Many Northerners, previously ambivalent about sectional tensions, responded with patriotic fervor. Recruitment offices overflowed, and enthusiasm for defending the Union surged. However, in the South, Lincoln's actions were interpreted as aggression, further justifying the decision of additional states to secede and commit fully to the Confederate cause. The war, once a distant threat, had now begun in earnest. The outbreak of war also revealed the stark contrasts in preparation and capability between the North and South. The Union, with a larger population and industrial base, could mobilize men, supplies, and weapons on a massive scale. The Confederacy, while lacking comparable resources, relied on strategic advantage, local knowledge, and the determination to defend its homeland. Both sides would quickly learn that enthusiasm and moral conviction alone were insufficient to sustain a protracted conflict. Fort Sumter's fall also had symbolic resonance. For the North, it underscored the urgency of preserving the Union and protecting the Constitution. For the South, it validated the belief that secession was both possible and necessary. The psychological impact of these first shots cannot be overstated. It transformed abstract political arguments into immediate, tangible stakes and committed the nation to 4 years of brutal warfare. The attack ignited debates across political, social, and moral arenas. Northern citizens debated the balance between states' rights and federal authority, the morality of defending Southern institutions, and the obligations of ordinary Americans to participate in the war effort. Southern leaders, meanwhile, grappled with questions of military strategy, diplomacy, and the integration of new states into the fledgling Confederacy. The intellectual, political, and social consequences of Fort Sumter would echo far beyond the harbor of Charleston, shaping the course of the war and the nation itself. By the end of April 1861, the United States had entered a conflict of unimaginable scale. The attack on Fort Sumter was the first spark, but the fire it ignited would consume the country for years, leaving a legacy of death, destruction, and transformation. What had begun as a dispute over states' rights, slavery, and political power had now escalated into a struggle over the very survival of the United States. The first shots at Fort Sumter were not just the beginning of a battle, they were the overture to a war that would define the American nation, challenge its moral and political ideals, and leave an indelible mark on its history. With the bombardment of Fort Sumter in April 1861, the United States officially entered a war that would test every aspect of the nation, its military, its politics, its economy, and its very sense of identity. Yet war does not begin with a single shot. It begins with preparation, mobilization, and the transformation of ordinary citizens into soldiers, a process that quickly revealed both the promise and peril of this conflict. In the North, President Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers galvanized a nation that had been politically divided but now found a shared cause in defending the Union. Recruitment offices filled rapidly as men from towns and cities, farmers from rural counties, and workers from burgeoning industrial centers answered the call. Many were motivated by patriotism, others by curiosity or a sense of adventure. Uniforms were distributed haphazardly, rifles were scarce, and training was rudimentary. In short, the Union Army at the outset of the war was largely inexperienced and improvisational, yet driven by a powerful sense of mission to preserve the Union at all costs. Meanwhile, in the South, the newly formed Confederacy undertook a parallel mobilization. The Confederate government called for volunteers, relying heavily on local militias and the fervor of men determined to defend their homeland. Unlike the North, the South could draw on long-standing traditions of military service and an intimate knowledge of local terrain. The Confederacy also faced challenges, including limited industrial capacity, fewer railroads, and a smaller population. These constraints would shape its military strategy, emphasizing defensive tactics and the hope that local resolve could offset material disadvantages. Training, supply, and organization were critical tasks for both sides. Camps sprang up across the North and South, from rural fields to the outskirts of cities. Drill instructors attempted to instill discipline in raw recruits, teaching them formations, marching techniques, and the rudimentary use of muskets and rifles. Yet discipline was uneven. Soldiers often struggled with the physical demands of marching, the technicalities of firing weapons accurately, and the logistical nightmare of feeding and housing thousands of men in temporary encampments. Despite these challenges, morale and enthusiasm were initially high. In the North, newspapers celebrated the volunteers. Parades marched through city streets, and speeches by local and national leaders stoked pride and patriotism. In the South, rallies and patriotic displays reinforced the narrative that men were defending home, honor, and a way of life threatened by the North's perceived aggression. This initial surge of commitment would later be tested by the brutal reality of modern warfare, but at the outset, both sides believed in the righteousness of their cause. The war's first engagements quickly highlighted the gap between enthusiasm and preparedness. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as Manassas, in July 1861, demonstrated that both armies were still learning the deadly art of war. Union forces, confident in their numbers and organization, advanced against Confederate positions in Virginia. Civilians, including families and curious onlookers, followed the battle with picnic baskets in tow, anticipating a quick and decisive victory. Instead, the engagement devolved into chaos. Confederate troops, reinforced by reserves and benefiting from interior lines, held their positions and counterattacked with determination. Union units, inexperienced and disoriented, struggled to maintain formation under the stress of gunfire and artillery. Panic spread among some soldiers, turning retreats into routs. Civilians watching from the hills were forced to flee as the reality of battle became unmistakable. By the end of the day, the Confederates had secured a victory, and the myth of a short, easy war was shattered. The significance of the First Battle of Bull Run extended beyond its tactical outcome. It was a wake-up call for both sides, demonstrating that the war would be longer, bloodier, and more complicated than anyone had imagined. Political leaders recognized that initial enthusiasm would need to be channeled into disciplined, sustained military effort. Recruitment alone would not suffice. Training, logistics, and leadership would become decisive factors. Logistics quickly became a central concern. Supplying armies in the field required vast quantities of food, ammunition, clothing, and medical care. Railroads, rivers, and roads became critical arteries for moving men and material. The North, with its industrial base and more extensive transportation network, had advantages in scale and mobility. But it also faced challenges coordinating complex supply chains across multiple theaters of war. The South, with fewer factories and shorter rail networks, relied on improvisation, local production, and capturing northern supplies when possible. Leadership was another crucial determinant. Both the Union and Confederate forces had a mixture of experienced officers and raw recruits. Some veterans of the Mexican-American War, such as Union Generals Winfield Scott and Irvin McDowell, or Confederate leaders like P.G.T. Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston, brought valuable tactical knowledge, yet the scale of the conflict stretched their expertise. New officers rose quickly through the ranks, learning under fire. Their decisions in these early battles would shape not only immediate outcomes, but also the confidence and morale of thousands of soldiers. The first months of mobilization also revealed the social dimensions of the war. Soldiers came from every walk of life, and their experiences in camps and on the battlefield transformed them. Letters home conveyed the excitement, fear, and camaraderie of military life. Communities on the home front grappled with the absence of men, shortages of supplies, and the emotional toll of casualty reports. Women, children, and the elderly became active participants in support efforts. raising funds, preparing uniforms, and caring for the sick and wounded. Medical care, however, lagged far behind the demands of modern warfare. Wounds that might have been survivable in later conflicts often became fatal due to infection, lack of proper sanitation, and rudimentary surgical techniques. The realities of disease, exposure, and battlefield injuries were shocking for both Union and Confederate soldiers. Casualty lists mounted quickly, shattering illusions of a swift, heroic war and forcing both armies to confront the human cost of combat. As the first battles unfolded, it became clear that strategy and geography would play decisive roles. The Confederacy, on the defensive, sought to protect its territory and extend the war long enough to make the North question the cost of victory. The Union, on the offensive, aimed to leverage its numerical and industrial superiority to split the Confederacy and regain control over seceded states. Each side adjusted tactics, learned from mistakes, and sought to exploit the weaknesses of the other. The period of mobilization and the first battles of the Civil War underscored a fundamental truth. Enthusiasm and ideology could ignite a war, but discipline, logistics, leadership, and endurance would determine its course. The conflict was no longer theoretical. It was physical, immediate, and devastatingly real. The Union and the Confederacy were locked in a deadly struggle, and the first months had already begun to shape the nature of a war that would ultimately redefine the United States. As the Civil War erupted in 1861, it became immediately clear to Union leaders that victory would not be won through passion alone. The nation's industrial and population advantages promised power, but turning resources into decisive military success required careful planning, strategy, and foresight. Early in the conflict, one of the most influential concepts to emerge was the Anaconda Plan, a strategic vision devised to suffocate the Confederacy without relying solely on direct battlefield victories. The Anaconda Plan was proposed by Union General Winfield Scott, a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. Despite being advanced in age and health, Scott's military experience gave him the perspective to recognize the enormity of the challenge. Rather than advocating immediate, large-scale assaults into the Confederate heartland, which could risk catastrophic losses, Scott proposed a long-term strategy designed to leverage the Union's strengths, its navy, its industrial capacity, and its control over transportation routes. The plan had three main components. First, the Union would implement a naval blockade of southern ports, preventing the Confederacy from exporting cotton and importing weapons, ammunition, and other essential supplies. This blockade aimed to strangle the Southern economy, cut off access to international markets, and reduce the Confederacy's ability to sustain its armies. Second, the Union would gain control of the Mississippi River and its tributaries, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and disrupting internal lines of communication and supply. Third, coordinated movements by Union armies would press into Confederate territory, gradually applying pressure while minimizing unnecessary casualties in large, premature engagements. At first, the Anaconda Plan was met with skepticism and criticism. Many in the North, inflamed by patriotic fervor and a desire for swift victory, saw Scott's cautious strategy as overly slow and timid. Newspapers demanded aggressive action, and politicians clamored for immediate confrontations that would produce headlines and victories. Yet the logic behind the plan was sound. The Union had immense resources, but needed time to mobilize them effectively. The South, by contrast, had fewer men, less industry, and limited infrastructure. A sustained blockade and strategic isolation could gradually weaken its capacity to resist. Implementing the plan required rapid and unprecedented military organization. The Union Navy, previously small and mostly coastal, needed to expand dramatically to enforce a blockade across thousands of miles of southern coastline. Ships were commissioned, refitted, and deployed, patrolling key ports such as Charleston, New Orleans, and Mobile. Blockade runners, small fast ships designed to evade Union patrols, became a constant challenge. But over time, the pressure on Southern trade began to mount. The blockade not only restricted supplies, but also created a sense of inevitability. The Confederacy could not survive indefinitely without outside trade. On land, the Union sought to control the Mississippi River. This massive waterway was the lifeline of the Western Confederacy, connecting vast agricultural regions to ports along the Gulf of Mexico. Securing it required complex coordination between the Union Army and Navy, as well as the capture of key strategic points such as New Orleans, Vicksburg, and Memphis. Success along the river would not only divide the South, but also provide a direct route for Union troops and supplies, enhancing operational flexibility. While the Anaconda Plan emphasized strategic patience, early military engagements demonstrated the challenges of turning theory into practice. Union generals attempted direct advances into Confederate territory, sometimes with disastrous results. The Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, for example, highlighted the inexperience of troops and the dangers of underestimating the enemy. Confederate forces, familiar with their terrain and highly motivated, could exploit mistakes and inexperience to achieve tactical victories, delaying the Union's broader strategic goals. The Confederate response to the Anaconda Plan focused on mobility, defense, and leveraging limited resources. Lacking the industrial base to challenge the North directly, Southern leaders aimed to defend key territory, protect vital transportation routes, and rely on interior lines to move forces efficiently. Southern armies emphasized the importance of morale and local support, often avoiding prolonged engagements unless they could achieve decisive results. At the same time, Confederate leaders sought international recognition, hoping that European reliance on Southern cotton might pressure the Union into concessions. The Anaconda Plan also had political dimensions. It offered Lincoln a strategy that minimized unnecessary bloodshed early in the war, while steadily applying pressure. By avoiding reckless frontal assaults, the plan helped preserve the Union's manpower for sustained campaigns. It also provided a framework for diplomatic messaging. The North could present itself as morally responsible and strategically prudent, committed to restoring the Union rather than seeking immediate punishment. Despite its long-term advantages, the plan required patience that was hard for soldiers, politicians, and the public to maintain. Early battles and skirmishes often diverted attention from the strategic vision, as both sides sought symbolic victories. Yet the logic of the Anaconda Plan would eventually guide Union strategy, particularly under leaders like Ulysses S. Grant, and William Tecumseh Sherman, who recognized that cutting the Confederacy off from resources and dividing its territory was as important as winning individual battles. In retrospect, the Anaconda Plan was revolutionary in its simplicity and foresight. It demonstrated an understanding of modern warfare that went beyond immediate tactical engagements, emphasizing economic pressure, control of transportation, and the leveraging of industrial capacity. It acknowledged that war was not only fought on the battlefield, but also in factories, harbors, and rivers. By recognizing the structural weaknesses of the Confederacy, Scott's strategy laid the foundation for eventual Union success. Even as the early months of the war were marked by confusion, setbacks, and the brutal learning curve of combat, ultimately, the Anaconda Plan highlighted a central truth of the Civil War. Victory required more than courage and conviction. It required organization, strategy, resources, and the patience to apply pressure over time. While the first battles may have captured public attention with dramatic heroism and immediate casualties, the larger war would be won by a calculated, persistent, and relentless approach. Exactly the method envisioned in Scott's plan, slowly constricting the Confederacy like the coils of a snake. As the Civil War expanded across the United States in 1861 and 1862, attention often focuses on generals, battles, and political maneuvering. But behind every strategic plan and historical headline were the ordinary men who filled the ranks, both North and South. Understanding the daily life of these soldiers provides an intimate glimpse into the human experience of the early war and the conditions that shaped morale, resilience, and the unfolding of history itself. The first day of fighting ended with the Union forces pushed back but not defeated. Union troops, under Grant's careful leadership, established defensive positions near the river, allowing reinforcements arriving via riverboats to stabilize the line. Both sides suffered tremendous losses. Estimates suggest that nearly 20,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing by the end of the day, shocking the nation with the scale of carnage in a single engagement. Civilians, who had once believed in the romanticized notion of a swift, decisive war, were confronted with the grim reality. The conflict was far bloodier and more costly than anticipated. The second day, April 7th, saw a dramatic reversal of fortune. Grant, reinforced by units under General Don Carlos Buell, launched a counteroffensive. The Union forces advanced steadily, regaining lost ground and forcing the Confederates to retreat toward Corinth. Exhausted, demoralized, and running low on supplies, Confederate troops withdrew from the field, effectively ceding control of southwestern Tennessee to Union forces. The battle, while tactically inconclusive in some respects, represented a strategic victory for the Union and a critical turning point in the Western theater. The aftermath of Shiloh revealed the immense human cost of the war and the harsh realities of early military campaigns. Soldiers faced horrific scenes of death and injury, often without adequate medical care. Wounded men lay on the battlefield for hours, exposed to sun, rain, and insects, while surgeons worked frantically to perform amputations and other life-saving procedures with rudimentary tools and minimal hygiene. Disease and infection compounded the toll, highlighting the challenges of sustaining armies in the field. Shiloh also had profound psychological effects. For Union forces, it demonstrated that success would require not just numbers or enthusiasm, but careful planning, resilience, and adaptability under fire. For the Confederacy, the battle underscored the difficulties of conducting offensive operations against a larger, better supplied adversary, and the limitations of leadership continuity when commanding officers were lost in combat. Public reaction was intense. Northern newspapers portrayed Shiloh as evidence that the war would be long, bloody, and transformative, while Southern publications highlighted both heroism and strategic necessity in the retreat, framing it as part of a larger struggle for survival. Beyond its immediate tactical and strategic implications, the Battle of Shiloh highlighted broader themes of the Western theater. Control of rivers, railroads, and supply lines was essential, and the geography of the region dictated both movement and engagement. The Union's growing industrial and logistical advantage began to manifest, allowing them to sustain operations deeper into Confederate territory. Simultaneously, Confederate forces learned the importance of coordinating reinforcements and maintaining supply lines in the face of superior Union resources. Shiloh also marked the beginning of modern, large-scale warfare in America. The intensity of combat, combined with high casualties and the use of massed formations and artillery, reflected a departure from earlier, smaller conflicts. The lessons learned at Shiloh about preparedness, command structure, and battlefield medicine would inform both Union and Confederate strategies for the remainder of the war. Officers and soldiers alike would carry the knowledge gained here into subsequent campaigns, shaping tactical decisions, fortification construction, and approaches to troop morale. In sum, the Battle of Shiloh was a defining moment in the early Civil War. It illustrated the deadly combination of surprise, terrain, leadership, and logistics, while highlighting the immense human suffering that would characterize the conflict. It also reinforced the strategic importance of the Western theater, showing that control of the Mississippi Valley, critical rivers, and rail networks would be essential for ultimate victory. For the Union, it was a first glimpse of success through perseverance, while for the Confederacy, it was a sobering reminder of the formidable challenge posed by a well-resourced and organized opponent. Shiloh was more than a battle. It was a microcosm of the war itself, brutal, chaotic, and transformative. The Western theater had proven its significance, and the lessons learned would resonate throughout subsequent campaigns, influencing the strategies and outcomes that would ultimately decide the fate of the United States. By 1862, Union leaders recognized that controlling the Mississippi River was critical to their long-term strategy. The river was more than a natural boundary. It was the lifeline of the Confederacy, connecting agricultural regions in the Deep South to key ports along the Gulf of Mexico. If the Union could secure this artery, it would split the Confederacy in two, isolating Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana from the rest of the South, and fulfilling a central component of the Anaconda Plan. At the heart of this strategy was the fortress city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg's strategic importance lay in its geography. Perched atop high bluffs overlooking a bend in the Mississippi River, the city offered an unparalleled defensive position. Its artillery could dominate river traffic, making it nearly impossible for Union ships to pass without coming under fire. Confederate commanders understood that holding Vicksburg was vital not only for logistics, but also for morale. Losing the city would mean surrendering control of the Isar, Mississippi, and undermining the Confederacy's capacity to sustain itself. Union General Ulysses S. Grant understood the stakes and approached the campaign with methodical precision. Grant's strategy combined maneuver, attrition, and siege tactics. Rather than a single frontal assault, he sought to isolate Vicksburg, cut off supplies, and exhaust both the city's defenders and the surrounding population. This approach reflected the Union's growing sophistication in logistics, engineering, and the application of combined arms, where infantry, artillery, and naval forces worked in concert to achieve strategic objectives. The campaign began in earnest in late 1862, with Grant advancing southward along the Mississippi and its tributaries. Several preliminary battles, including Port Gibson, Raymond, and Champion Hill, were designed to weaken Confederate positions and secure the surrounding countryside. These engagements showcased Grant's aggressive style. He balanced speed with coordination, pressing Confederate forces relentlessly while minimizing opportunities for retreat or counterattack. The victories leading up to Vicksburg were essential in isolating the city and boosting Union morale, demonstrating that persistence and planning could overcome formidable defensive positions. Once encirclement was achieved, the siege itself began in May 1863. The Union Army established fortified positions on the surrounding high ground, cutting off Vicksburg from reinforcements and supplies. Artillery bombardments rained down on the city almost continuously, targeting fortifications, military installations, and, inevitably, civilian areas. Civilians endured relentless shelling, shortages of food and water, and the psychological stress of living under constant threat. Confederate soldiers within the city faced similarly grueling conditions: limited rations, inadequate shelter, disease, and the constant pressure of Union fire. The siege of Vicksburg was as much a psychological campaign as a physical one. Grant recognized that war was not only about defeating troops in combat, but also about undermining the will to resist. The continuous bombardment, combined with the isolation of the city, aimed to wear down both the defenders and the civilian population, making surrender increasingly likely. Confederate commanders attempted sorties and counterattacks, but each was repelled, gradually depleting their resources and morale. Grant's methodical approach to the Vicksburg campaign exemplified the Union's strategic evolution. Early battles in the war had highlighted the dangers of rash frontal assaults and poor coordination. Vicksburg demonstrated that patience, logistical planning, and combined operations could achieve decisive results without incurring unnecessary losses. Union forces built trenches, established supply lines, and coordinated with the Union Navy, which patrolled the Mississippi to prevent Confederate reinforcements or supply shipments from reaching the city. After more than 40 days of siege, with supplies exhausted and morale at breaking point, Confederate General John C. Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863. The timing was symbolic. Independence Day became a moment of profound strategic significance, marking the Union's control of the Mississippi River and the effective division of the Confederacy. Grant's victory was celebrated in the North as a turning point, confirming that Union strategy, leadership, and perseverance could overcome even the most formidable Confederate positions. The fall of Vicksburg had far-reaching consequences. Logistically, it gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, allowing troops and supplies to move freely while isolating the Western Confederate states. Morally, it was a devastating blow to the Confederacy, undermining confidence in leadership and demonstrating the effectiveness of Union strategy. Politically, it bolstered Northern support for the war, proving that the Union could achieve tangible victories through careful planning and persistence. Vicksburg also highlighted the evolving nature of modern warfare. The siege demonstrated the importance of entrenchments, artillery coordination, and control of supply lines. Civilians were no longer incidental to military campaigns. They were directly affected by the outcome, as shortages, bombardment, and the collapse of local economies imposed profound hardships. The campaign foreshadowed the brutal, attritional warfare that would characterize later battles, particularly in the Eastern Theater and during General Sherman's campaigns in Georgia and the Carolinas. Furthermore, Vicksburg cemented Ulysses S. Grant's reputation as a brilliant and relentless commander. His ability to coordinate multiple operations, maintain the initiative, and apply sustained pressure without succumbing to impatience or rash attacks distinguished him from many contemporaries. Grant's approach would later influence Union strategy in campaigns such as Chattanooga, the Overland Campaign, and ultimately the Siege of Petersburg. In conclusion, the Siege of Vicksburg and the broader Mississippi Campaign exemplify the interplay between strategy, logistics, and leadership that defined the Civil War. Control of geography, rivers, and transportation networks proved as decisive as battlefield victories. Grant's methodical approach demonstrated the Union's growing military sophistication, while the Confederate defense highlighted the limitations of a smaller, resource-constrained force facing a determined and well-supplied opponent. The fall of Vicksburg was not just a tactical victory, it was a transformative moment in the Civil War, shaping the trajectory of the conflict and bringing the Union closer to ultimate success. By mid-1862, the Civil War had evolved into a conflict not only over the preservation of the Union, but also over the institution of slavery itself. While the war had initially been framed largely in terms of federal authority versus secession, President Abraham Lincoln recognized that the moral and political dimensions of slavery could, and ultimately would, become central to the conflict. This recognition led to one of the most significant and transformative decisions in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. The context for the proclamation was both strategic and moral. The Union had suffered a series of inconclusive battles in the Eastern Theater, including the Peninsula Campaign, and there was mounting pressure to demonstrate clear progress. Slavery was both a moral blight and a strategic asset for the Confederacy. Enslaved people provided labor for plantations, infrastructure, and even military support, sustaining the Southern war effort. By redefining the war as a struggle against slavery, Lincoln sought to undermine the Confederacy's economic and social foundation while galvanizing support in the North. Lincoln had been cautious about emancipation from the start of his presidency. He recognized the delicate balance of border states, slaveholding states that remained loyal to the Union, whose support was crucial to military and political stability. Immediate abolition in these states risked pushing them into the Confederacy. Instead, Lincoln framed emancipation as a war measure, targeting states in rebellion, where he claimed constitutional authority to act as commander-in-chief. By doing so, He aimed to weaken the Confederacy without alienating loyal slaveholding states. On September 22, 1862, following the Union's partial victory at the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued a preliminary proclamation. It declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The wording was precise and calculated. It did not free slaves in Union-controlled areas or border states, reflecting Lincoln's commitment to maintaining loyalty while exerting pressure on the rebellious states. The proclamation also invited formerly enslaved people to join the Union war effort, opening the door for the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. The Emancipation Proclamation was revolutionary in its scope and implications. It transformed the war from a political and military struggle into a moral crusade, signaling that the Union was committed not only to preserving the nation, but also to challenging the institution of slavery itself. This shift altered international perceptions as well. European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, had been considering recognition of the Confederacy. By making slavery a central issue, Lincoln effectively undermined Southern diplomacy, making it politically and morally difficult for foreign nations to support the Confederacy without appearing to endorse slavery. The proclamation also had profound social and cultural consequences. For enslaved people in Confederate-held territory, it was a beacon of hope. News of the proclamation spread through word of mouth, letters, and the movements of escaping slaves. Thousands of enslaved individuals seized the opportunity to flee plantations, seek Union lines, and contribute to the war effort as laborers, guides, and eventually soldiers. Their courage and determination added a new dimension to the conflict, reinforcing the moral stakes and providing critical manpower to Union forces. In practical terms, the Emancipation Proclamation also reshaped military strategy. Black regiments, formally authorized in the aftermath of the proclamation, became integral to the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African American men had served in the Union forces, bringing strength, motivation, and unique knowledge of Southern terrain. Their participation not only bolstered Union numbers, but also symbolized a transformation in the character of the war. It was now explicitly tied to the liberation of millions of human beings. The proclamation was met with mixed reactions. In the North, abolitionists celebrated it as a historic moral victory, while some moderates feared that it would prolong the war or provoke backlash from border states. In the South, it was denounced as an act of aggression and a threat to the social order. Confederate leaders dismissed it as unenforceable, given that the Union had no control over the territories in question. Yet, despite these criticisms, the proclamation shifted the narrative, making it clear that any Confederate victory could no longer be separated from the institution of slavery. The significance of the Emancipation Proclamation extended beyond its immediate wartime effects. While it did not end slavery throughout the United States, that achievement would come with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865. It fundamentally redefined the moral and legal trajectory of the nation. It asserted that the federal government could take decisive action to challenge slavery as an institution, laying the groundwork for constitutional and social transformation. By linking the Union's survival to the cause of human freedom, Lincoln elevated the stakes of the conflict and created a unifying principle around which Northern public opinion could rally. In addition, the proclamation reshaped public memory and the cultural understanding of the war. It reframed the conflict not merely as a struggle for territory or political authority, but as a decisive moral struggle, aligning the Union with justice, freedom, and human dignity. Over time, the Emancipation Proclamation would be celebrated as a defining moment in American history, a symbol of courage, leadership, and moral vision, even as the war itself continued to test the nation's endurance and values. In conclusion, the Emancipation Proclamation was a transformative act that reshaped the Civil War's purpose, character, and consequences. By linking the Union's military and political objectives with the abolition of slavery, Lincoln created a dual mandate to preserve the nation and to redefine its moral foundations. Its impact was immediate, practical, and symbolic, influencing military strategy, international diplomacy, and the lives of millions of enslaved individuals. The proclamation marked a turning point, demonstrating that the Civil War was no longer solely a contest of armies and territories, but a struggle for the very soul of the nation, shaping the future of the United States for generations to come. By the summer of 1863, the Civil War had entered its third year, and the conflict had grown more brutal, expansive, and strategically complex. While much of the fighting had occurred in the South and along key rivers, Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched an ambitious campaign into Union territory, aiming to relieve pressure on Virginia, threaten northern cities, and potentially sway political opinion in the North. This campaign culminated in the pivotal engagement at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a battle that would become the defining turning point of the Civil War. Gettysburg was not initially chosen as a battlefield. Lee's army, seeking supplies and to disrupt Union communication lines, advanced northward through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. Union forces under General George G. Meade, newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, moved to intercept Lee. On July 1st, 1863, skirmishes around the small town of Gettysburg escalated into a full-scale confrontation, drawing tens of thousands of soldiers into a chaotic and deadly engagement. The first day of battle saw Confederate forces pushing back Union defenders, but failing to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Fighting occurred across fields, woods, and ridges, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Local civilians were suddenly caught in the crossfire, their homes and properties transformed into hospitals and supply depots. By nightfall, the Union Army held the high ground south of town, while Lee's forces occupied positions to the west and north, setting the stage for 2 days of intense combat. The second day, July 2nd, brought some of the fiercest fighting of the battle. Lee attempted to outflank the Union positions, sending troops against strongholds at Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, and Devil's Den. The Union defenders, aware that losing these positions could compromise their lines, fought with extraordinary determination. The defense of Little Round Top, led by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine, became legendary for its combination of tactical ingenuity and sheer courage. Charges, counterattacks, and desperate hand-to-hand combat characterized the day, leaving the landscape littered with casualties and the air thick with smoke and dust. On July 3rd, Lee made the fateful decision to launch a massive assault on the Union center, later known as Pickett's Charge. Approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers advanced across open fields for nearly a mile under heavy artillery and rifle fire. Despite remarkable bravery, the assault was decisively repelled, with staggering losses for the Confederacy. The failure of Pickett's charge marked the high water point of Lee's northern invasion, signaling a turning of the tide in favor of the Union. By the end of the third day, Lee's army began a retreat back into Virginia, pursued cautiously by Meade, but with both sides bearing enormous human costs. The Battle of Gettysburg was not only a tactical engagement, but also a strategic watershed. It halted Lee's advance into Northern Territory, relieving the immediate threat to cities like Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. More importantly, it provided a psychological boost to the Union, demonstrating that Confederate forces were not invincible and that the Union Army could hold its ground under extreme pressure. Gettysburg reshaped Northern morale, giving civilians and soldiers alike renewed confidence in ultimate victory. The scale of Gettysburg was staggering. Estimates suggest that over 160,000 soldiers participated, with casualties exceeding 50,000. The battlefield became a vast landscape of destruction, with makeshift hospitals overwhelmed by the wounded. Amputation was common, as medical techniques were still rudimentary, and disease claimed additional lives. Letters and diaries from participants reveal the mixture of fear, resolve, and exhaustion that defined the experience, while local civilians faced displacement, property damage, and the haunting aftermath of carnage. Gettysburg also had profound political and cultural significance. It reinforced the moral dimensions of the war, particularly following the Emancipation Proclamation, by framing Union victory as essential not only to national survival, but also to the cause of human freedom. The battle underscored the stakes of the conflict. Failure to resist could embolden the Confederacy and prolong the war, while success offered the possibility of decisive momentum. In November 1863, President Lincoln visited the Gettysburg battlefield to dedicate the soldiers' national cemetery and deliver his now famous Gettysburg Address. In fewer than 3 minutes, Lincoln articulated the symbolic importance of the battle, emphasizing the principles of liberty, equality, and national unity. His words elevated the battle from a military engagement to a moral and historical touchstone, linking the sacrifices of soldiers to the broader purpose of the Union. Gettysburg also reflected the evolution of Civil War combat. The battle demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of rifled muskets, artillery, and defensive positions, as well as the importance of high ground, reconnaissance, and communication. Commanders on both sides learned valuable lessons about coordination, logistics, and troop movement, shaping subsequent campaigns and strategies. The battle's intensity foreshadowed the scale and devastation of later engagements, reinforcing the reality that this war was no longer a series of skirmishes, but a total, transformative conflict. In conclusion, the Battle of Gettysburg was a defining moment in the Civil War, combining tactical complexity, strategic importance, and profound human consequence. It marked the end of Lee's northern ambitions, bolstered Union morale, and elevated the war's moral and political dimensions. The heroism, suffering, and resilience of the soldiers who fought there, along with the enduring symbolism captured in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, ensured that Gettysburg would occupy a central place in both military history and the national consciousness. Its lessons about leadership, strategy, and the human cost of war would resonate for the remainder of the conflict, shaping the course of the Civil War and the future of the United States. By late 1864, the Civil War had entered a new phase. Union forces, particularly under General William Tecumseh Sherman, adopted strategies that emphasized total war, targeting not only enemy armies, but also the infrastructure, resources, and morale of the Confederacy. Sherman's March to the Sea, which began in November 1864 from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, exemplified this approach, demonstrating the Union's ability to project power deep into Southern territory and signaling a shift in the nature of warfare. Sherman's objectives were both strategic and psychological. Militarily, he aimed to disrupt Confederate supply lines, destroy railroads, and weaken the South's ability to continue the fight. Politically, he sought to demoralize the Southern population and convince them that the Confederacy could not sustain the war. Unlike traditional campaigns focused on direct confrontation with enemy forces, Sherman's march relied on mobility, foraging, and systematic destruction of resources, demonstrating a recognition that wars could be won by undermining the enemy's capacity to wage them. The march covered roughly 300 miles of Georgia, with Union forces living off the land while destroying crops, livestock, rail lines, and industrial facilities. Cities, plantations, and towns were often stripped of resources, leaving local populations in desperate conditions. Sherman's troops moved quickly and decisively, prioritizing speed and efficiency over occupation, ensuring that Confederate forces could not mount an effective counterattack. The march also relied on the coordination of infantry, cavalry, and artillery units, exemplifying Union logistical skill and operational planning. Sherman's approach was controversial. To the South, it represented a terrifying form of total war that targeted civilians as well as combatants. Many residents viewed it as punitive, a deliberate attempt to break the spirit of the Southern people. In the North, however, the march was celebrated as a demonstration of Union resolve, showing that victory was possible and that the war could be brought to the heart of the Confederacy. The march also provided a strategic complement to other Union operations, tying down Confederate forces and facilitating Grant's campaigns in Virginia. By the time Sherman reached Savannah in December 1864, his forces had succeeded in capturing the city and effectively crippling Confederate resources in Georgia. The march had demonstrated the Union's ability to operate independently of traditional supply lines, relying on mobility and resourcefulness. It also marked a psychological turning point. The Confederacy could no longer rely on interior lines for safety, and the inevitability of Union victory became increasingly apparent. Sherman's campaign remains a landmark example of strategic innovation, total war, and the interplay of military, political, and psychological factors in the Civil War. By early 1865, the Confederacy was in crisis, with Union forces applying pressure from multiple directions. Confederate cities, armies, and resources were stretched to the breaking point. The Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia, became a focal point. Its capture would symbolize the collapse of the Confederate government and bring the war to a decisive conclusion. Union General Ulysses S. Grant leading the Army of the Potomac, advanced relentlessly through Virginia. Over the course of the Overland Campaign, battles such as Spotsylvania Courthouse and Cold Harbor inflicted heavy casualties on both sides, but Grant's strategy emphasized attrition, maintaining pressure despite losses. This relentless approach exhausted Confederate forces under General Robert E. Lee, whose army, though skilled and determined, could not replace men or materiel as quickly as the Union. By April 1865, Lee's army was surrounded and severely depleted. Richmond's fall was imminent. Confederate leaders, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, evacuated the city, burning supply depots and strategic infrastructure to deny them to Union forces. Union troops entered Richmond on April 3, 1865, discovering a city partially destroyed but largely intact, with residents enduring hardship and fear. The capture of Richmond was a symbolic and strategic victory, signaling the imminent collapse of the Confederate government. Lee attempted to continue resistance, retreating westward to regroup and link with other Confederate forces. However, Union forces pursued relentlessly. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant, effectively ending major Confederate military operations. The terms of surrender were generous, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with personal possessions and horses, reflecting Grant's desire to promote reconciliation and avoid further bloodshed. The fall of Richmond and Lee's surrender marked the culmination of 4 years of brutal conflict. The Union had preserved the nation, ended the secession crisis, and set the stage for the abolition of slavery. The cost had been immense. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers dead, wounded, or missing, alongside widespread destruction in the South. Yet the surrender also signaled a path toward reconstruction, healing, and the redefinition of national identity. It demonstrated that persistence, strategic planning, and coordinated military action could overcome even the most determined opposition. With the Civil War's end in April 1865, the United States faced an enormous challenge: rebuilding a nation torn apart by 4 years of devastating conflict. This period, known as Reconstruction, involved political, social, and economic efforts to reintegrate the southern states, rebuild infrastructure, and address the status of formerly enslaved people. It was a time of hope, uncertainty, and intense conflict over the future of the country. Reconstruction began with the question of how to reintegrate the South into the Union. President Abraham Lincoln initially proposed a moderate approach through his 10% plan, which offered amnesty to most Confederates who pledged loyalty to the Union and allowed states to reestablish governments once 10% of their voters had taken the oath. Lincoln's vision emphasized reconciliation and a swift restoration of national unity, aiming to heal the nation without punishing the South excessively. Following Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency. Johnson's approach largely continued Lincoln's moderate policies, granting pardons to many Southern elites and allowing former Confederate states to establish governments with minimal federal oversight. While this approach succeeded in quickly restoring political control to Southern elites, it failed to protect the newly freed African Americans or ensure lasting reforms. The social reality of Reconstruction was complex and often brutal. Freed people, suddenly liberated from slavery, faced the challenge of establishing livelihoods, education, and legal rights in hostile environments. Many sought to reunite with family members, claim land, and participate in civic life. However, white supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, violently resisted these changes, using intimidation and murder to maintain control over social and political structures. Federal intervention, including the deployment of troops and the passage of enforcement laws, attempted to protect rights, but enforcement was inconsistent and often insufficient. Reconstruction also involved economic rebuilding. Southern cities and farms lay in ruins, and the destruction of railroads, factories, and plantations hindered recovery. Freed people often worked as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, a system that offered limited autonomy but often trapped them in cycles of debt and poverty. Meanwhile, Northern investment and federal programs slowly began to rebuild infrastructure. Though progress was uneven, ultimately, Reconstruction was a period of experimentation, struggle, and transformation. It sought to redefine citizenship, civil rights, and the relationship between federal and state authority. While the period achieved significant progress, particularly in the establishment of public education and civil rights legislation, it also revealed deep tensions that would persist for generations. Reconstruction set the stage for the ongoing struggle to achieve equality, justice, and national unity in the post-war United States. The conclusion of the Civil War created an urgent need to legally abolish slavery throughout the United States, ensuring that the freedom granted by the Emancipation Proclamation would endure beyond the battlefield. This legal foundation came in the form of the 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865, which permanently outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. The amendment's journey began in Congress during the war as Republican lawmakers sought to solidify Lincoln's wartime measures into lasting constitutional law. Unlike the Emancipation Proclamation, which applied only to areas in rebellion, the 13th Amendment had universal reach, guaranteeing freedom to all enslaved people, including those in border states that had remained loyal to the Union. Its language was deliberately clear and uncompromising, stating, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States." Ratification required a two-thirds majority in Congress and approval by three-fourths of the states, a monumental political challenge given the immediate post-war tensions. Southern states initially resisted, but the presence of Union troops and the new political realities ensured eventual compliance. Northern states, meanwhile, pushed for ratification to enshrine the principles of freedom and equality into the nation's highest law. The 13th Amendment represented not only legal reform, but also a symbolic and moral declaration. The United States could no longer tolerate slavery under any circumstances. The impact of the 13th Amendment was profound and multifaceted. For formerly enslaved people, it transformed legal status from temporary freedom under military authority to permanent citizenship rights, at least in theory. It provided a constitutional foundation for subsequent civil rights legislation, including the 14th and 15th Amendments, which addressed citizenship, due process, and voting rights. Economically and socially, the amendment forced the South to adapt to a new labor system, shifting from enslaved labor to wage labor and sharecropping. with significant consequences for both freed people and landowners. The ratification also reinforced the Union's victory in moral and political terms. By permanently abolishing slavery, the nation affirmed that the principles of liberty and equality were no longer negotiable. However, the amendment's promise was only partially realized immediately. Systemic discrimination, segregation, and violence would continue to challenge African Americans' full integration into American society. Nonetheless, the 13th Amendment laid the legal foundation for freedom and justice, marking the definitive end of centuries of chattel slavery in the United States and codifying a principle for which countless individuals had fought and suffered. In conclusion, the 13th Amendment was both a legal milestone and a moral triumph. It transformed the Civil War from a conflict over secession and union into a fight that permanently reshaped the nation's understanding of freedom, human rights, and justice. Its ratification represented a decisive moment in American history, ensuring that slavery could never again be legally sanctioned and marking a crucial step in the long and ongoing journey toward equality. Following the Civil War, the United States faced the monumental task of redefining citizenship, civil rights, and the balance of power between federal and state governments. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, emerged as the cornerstone of this effort, fundamentally reshaping the Constitution and the legal landscape of the nation. While the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, the 14th and 15th Amendments ensured that the principles of equality and citizenship were legally enforceable, addressing critical gaps in rights and protections for newly freed African Americans. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, was transformative in scope. It established that anyone born or naturalized in the United States was a citizen, providing former slaves with legal recognition and protection under federal law. The amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law, challenging states' abilities to enact discriminatory legislation. This principle became a foundation for future civil rights progress, as it allowed federal courts to intervene when states violated citizens' constitutional rights. Additionally, the 14th Amendment addressed representation and taxation, reducing political power for states that denied voting rights and embedding mechanisms to incentivize inclusion. Following closely, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, focused specifically on voting rights. It prohibited the federal and state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, while not immediately ensuring universal suffrage. Women and other marginalized groups were still excluded. It represented a monumental step in extending democratic participation to African American men and symbolized the nation's commitment to equality, at least on paper. The passage of these amendments faced fierce resistance from Southern states. Many former Confederates sought to undermine Reconstruction through black codes, discriminatory laws designed to restrict African Americans' freedoms, economic opportunities, and political power. White supremacist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, employed violence and intimidation to enforce racial hierarchies. The federal government responded with military interventions and enforcement acts using constitutional authority to uphold the amendments and protect civil rights. Though the effectiveness of these measures varied over time, the Reconstruction Amendments were revolutionary not only for their immediate legal impact, but also for their long-term significance. They represented a decisive shift in the balance of power between federal and state governments, affirming that the federal Constitution could be used to protect individual rights against local oppression, while full enforcement would face decades of struggle. These amendments laid the foundation for future civil rights movements, creating a legal framework for equality and justice that remains central to American democracy. The Civil War was not only a defining moment of the 19th century, but also a transformative event whose legacy continues to shape the United States. The war resolved the existential crisis of secession, preserved the Union, and abolished slavery, yet it left deep and lasting impacts on the nation's politics, society, economy, and culture. Politically, the war solidified the supremacy of the federal government over the states. The challenge posed by secession and the Confederacy forced a reassertion of national authority, affirming that states could not unilaterally leave the Union. This precedent influenced American federalism for generations, ensuring that the Constitution remained the ultimate arbiter of national unity. The Civil War also accelerated the development of the modern presidency, as Lincoln's leadership during wartime expanded executive authority and established the principle that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary powers. Socially and culturally, the Civil War transformed the nation's understanding of freedom and equality. The abolition of slavery, codified in the 13th Amendment, marked the formal end of one of the most profound injustices in American history. The Reconstruction Amendments extended citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people, though persistent discrimination and segregation would follow. African Americans' participation in military service, politics, and civic life during and after the war demonstrated their determination to claim their place in the national community, laying the groundwork for future civil rights struggles. Economically, the war accelerated industrialization in the North while devastating the Southern economy. The destruction of infrastructure, plantations, and labor systems forced the South to adopt new economic models, including sharecropping and tenant farming. Meanwhile, the North's industrial base expanded to meet wartime demands, fostering innovations in transportation, manufacturing, and finance that would propel post-war growth. Culturally, the Civil War left an enduring imprint on national memory. Monuments, literature, music, and commemorative rituals reflected both the heroism and the tragedy of the conflict. The war's scale, intensity, and human cost fostered a collective understanding of sacrifice and a national identity, shaping how subsequent generations interpreted citizenship, liberty, and the price of freedom. The Civil War's legacy is also a cautionary tale about unresolved issues and enduring divisions. The promises of Reconstruction were only partially realized, and systemic inequality persisted in the South for decades. Yet the war ultimately created a framework for legal, social, and political progress, embedding principles of liberty, equality, and national unity into the Constitution and national consciousness. In conclusion, the long-term legacy of the Civil War is profound and multifaceted. It preserved the Union, abolished slavery, strengthened federal authority, and redefined citizenship, while also exposing the persistent challenges of achieving justice and equality. Its lessons continue to resonate, reminding Americans of the costs of division, the importance of moral leadership, and the enduring work required to realize the ideals of freedom and democracy. The American Civil War did not end with Lee's surrender in 1865. Its legacy continued to evolve in the minds, culture, and scholarship of the nation. The way Americans remembered the war, its causes, battles, heroes, and victims, has profoundly influenced the country's historical consciousness and public identity. The study of Civil War memory and historiography reveals as much about Americans' changing values as it does about the war itself. Immediately after the war, memory was shaped by those who experienced it firsthand. Veterans organizations, such as the Grand Army of the Republic in the North and the United Confederate Veterans in the South, commemorated their own perspectives, often emphasizing heroism, sacrifice, and regional pride. These groups constructed narratives that honored soldiers' courage while sometimes softening the causes of the conflict or the harsh realities of slavery. Monuments and battlefield memorials became focal points, reflecting both remembrance and selective interpretation of events. Southern memory, particularly, evolved into the lost cause narrative, which framed the Confederacy's struggle as noble and heroic, while downplaying or justifying the central role of slavery. Leaders like Jefferson Davis and historians sympathetic to the South promoted this perspective, influencing textbooks, ceremonies, and public discourse for decades. This interpretation often emphasized states' rights, honor, and military valor, and it became embedded in Southern identity, complicating national reconciliation. Northern memory, while more directly aligned with Union victory and emancipation, also emphasized heroism and sacrifice, sometimes overshadowing the experiences of enslaved people and African American soldiers. Commemorations highlighted generals like Ulysses S. Grant and Abraham Lincoln, shaping the public perception of leadership and moral purpose. Monuments and national cemeteries reinforced these themes, creating a visual and cultural legacy that shaped American understanding of the war. Historiography, the scholarly study of the Civil War, has evolved dramatically over time. Early histories focused on battles, leaders, and political narratives. Later, scholarship incorporated social, economic, and cultural perspectives, exploring the lives of ordinary soldiers, enslaved people, and civilians. Modern historians examine race, gender, and class, as well as the long-term consequences of the war for American society. The Civil War has become a lens for understanding broader themes, including democracy, liberty, and the ongoing struggle for equality. In conclusion, the memory and historiography of the Civil War reveal the conflict's enduring impact. Public memory, shaped by monuments, narratives, and regional pride, influenced how generations understood the war, while academic scholarship has continually reassessed and deepened understanding. Together, they illustrate that the Civil War is not only a historical event, but also a living dialogue about the nation's values, identity, and lessons learned from its most defining crisis. The American Civil War offers profound lessons in leadership, strategy, social change, and national unity. Beyond its immediate historical consequences, the war provides enduring insights into the costs of division, the challenges of Reconstruction, and the moral responsibilities of governance and citizenship. One central lesson concerns the dangers of political and social polarization. The secession of Southern states demonstrated how unresolved political, economic, and moral conflicts can escalate into violent conflict. The war underscores the importance of dialogue, compromise, and institutional mechanisms to address deep divisions before they threaten national cohesion. Similarly, the challenges of Reconstruction revealed how difficult it is to achieve reconciliation and justice after prolonged conflict, emphasizing the need for long-term planning and protections for vulnerable populations. The Civil War also teaches enduring lessons about military strategy and leadership. Commanders like Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and William Tecumseh Sherman demonstrated the interplay of tactics, logistics, and morale in achieving objectives. Grant's persistence and coordination, Lee's audacity and defensive skill, and Sherman's innovative application of total war illustrate the importance of adapting strategy to context, understanding resources, and balancing boldness with pragmatism. These lessons continue to inform military thinking worldwide. From a social perspective, the war highlights the profound consequences of institutionalized injustice. Slavery was a central issue of the conflict, and the abolition of slavery demonstrated the necessity of moral and legal action to correct systemic oppression. The struggles of freed people during and after the war reveal the complexities of transitioning from liberation to equality, emphasizing the ongoing work required to secure civil rights and social justice. Legal measures, such as the Reconstruction Amendments, provide examples of structural solutions to deep societal inequities. The war also demonstrates the importance of national unity and resilience. Despite devastating losses, the United States survived and evolved, illustrating how shared commitment to foundational principles can sustain a nation through extreme crises. It shows that political, economic, and social recovery is possible even after profound disruption, but only with deliberate effort, leadership, and a willingness to address both practical and moral challenges. Finally, the Civil War offers lessons in historical memory and interpretation. How societies remember and narrate conflict shapes culture, identity, and policy. Understanding the multiple perspectives of the war, soldiers, civilians, enslaved people, and leaders, encourages empathy, critical thinking, and recognition of complexity. These insights are essential not only for historians, but for all citizens seeking to learn from the past to inform the present and future. In conclusion, the Civil War's lessons extend far beyond the battlefield. It illuminates the costs of division, the importance of moral leadership, the challenges of Reconstruction, and the enduring necessity of justice and equality. Its legacy is both cautionary and inspirational, reminding the nation of the work required to preserve freedom, unity, and human dignity. One of the most transformative aspects of the Civil War was the participation of African American soldiers in the Union Army. Following the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, formerly enslaved and free, black men were officially authorized to enlist, fundamentally altering the social, political, and military dimensions of the conflict. African American soldiers were often motivated by a combination of personal freedom, loyalty to the Union, and a desire to strike a blow against the institution of slavery. Estimates suggest that roughly 200,000 African American men served in the Union Army, while tens of thousands participated in the Navy. Their service was both a profound act of courage and a direct challenge to Confederate claims of racial superiority, demonstrating that African Americans could fight, lead, and sacrifice on equal terms with white soldiers. Units like the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment became emblematic of this bravery. The 54th Massachusetts, led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, earned national acclaim for its assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Despite suffering heavy casualties, their courage inspired other African Americans to enlist and convinced Northern society of the moral and strategic significance of their participation. These units also faced extreme prejudice, including unequal pay, harsher labor duties, and skepticism from some white officers. Over time, persistent performance and dedication gradually changed perceptions, contributing to a broader recognition of African Americans' capabilities and rights. The military contributions of African American soldiers had tangible effects on the war's outcome. They provided critical manpower, often serving in combat roles that complemented Union strategies across multiple theaters. Their involvement also allowed the Union to pursue more ambitious campaigns, knowing that every additional regiment strengthened the overall war effort. Moreover, their presence symbolized the moral dimension of the conflict. The fight was not solely about preserving the Union, but also about securing freedom and human dignity. Beyond the battlefield, African American soldiers' service had lasting social and political implications. Their participation laid the groundwork for post-war civil rights advocacy and the eventual Reconstruction amendments. By proving their ability to fight and sacrifice, African Americans challenged societal norms and demanded inclusion in civic life, education, and political representation. Their courage became a cornerstone of the broader struggle for equality, making their role in the Civil War both strategically vital and historically transformative. In conclusion, African American soldiers played a pivotal role in shaping the Civil War's military and moral dimensions. Their service embodied courage, resilience, and the pursuit of freedom, directly impacting Union victories and the nation's understanding of citizenship, equality, and justice. The Civil War was as much a revolution in technology and military innovation as it was a conflict over territory and ideology. From weaponry to transportation, the war introduced new tools and methods that transformed the nature of combat and left a lasting impact on military strategy. Worldwide, one of the most significant innovations was the widespread use of rifled muskets and minié-balls, which dramatically increased accuracy and lethality compared to earlier smoothbore firearms. Soldiers could now fire at longer distances with greater precision, making traditional massed formations far more vulnerable. This technological change contributed to the extraordinarily high casualty rates, as infantry charges and frontal assaults often resulted in devastating losses. Artillery also evolved during the Civil War. Cannons became more powerful, mobile, and precise. Field artillery and siege guns could bombard enemy positions from greater distances, while ironclad ships like the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia transformed naval warfare. The battle between these two ironclads at Hampton Roads in 1862 demonstrated the obsolescence of wooden warships and heralded the era of armored naval vessels. Rivers and waterways became strategic corridors, and the use of steam-powered vessels allowed for rapid troop movements and logistical support. Railroads were another critical innovation. Both Union and Confederate armies relied heavily on rail networks to transport troops, supplies, and equipment over vast distances. The Union's superior industrial capacity allowed for extensive use of railroads, providing logistical advantages that contributed to strategic mobility and operational success. Telegraph lines, often installed alongside railroads, enabled faster communication, allowing commanders to coordinate movements and respond to changing battlefield conditions with unprecedented speed. Medical and logistical innovations, while driven by necessity, also emerged. Ambulance corps, field hospitals, and triage systems were developed to manage the unprecedented scale of casualties. Though still rudimentary by modern standards, these efforts represented a significant improvement in wartime medical care and highlighted the interplay between technology, organization, and human survival. The Civil War also foreshadowed modern total war, where industrial, technological, and logistical capabilities directly influence military success. Weapons, transportation, and communication innovations reshaped both strategy and tactics, demonstrating that wars were no longer fought solely with manpower, but also with the effective application of technological and organizational resources. In conclusion, technological innovation was a defining feature of the Civil War. Rifled muskets, artillery advancements, ironclads, railroads, and telegraphs transformed the battlefield, increasing lethality, mobility, and coordination. These developments not only influenced the outcome of the Civil War, but also shaped the future of warfare, bridging the gap between traditional conflicts and modern industrialized war. While battles raged across the country, civilian life during the Civil War was profoundly disrupted, particularly in the South, but also in the North. The war transformed everyday routines, economies, and social structures, placing immense strain on families, communities, and individuals who were far removed from the front lines, yet deeply affected by its consequences. In the South, civilians faced widespread hardship as Union armies advanced through key territories. Cities and towns were occupied, supply lines were cut, and plantations, the backbone of the Southern economy, were disrupted. Families often fled, abandoning homes and possessions to escape advancing troops, while those who remained endured shortages of food, medicine, and other necessities. The destruction of infrastructure, including railroads, bridges, and mills, further complicated daily life, leaving civilians isolated and vulnerable. Women assumed crucial roles during the war. With men away fighting, they managed farms, businesses, and households under difficult circumstances. Many also served as nurses or volunteers, providing care for wounded soldiers in makeshift hospitals. Figures like Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, became emblematic of women's contributions, exemplifying courage, organization, and compassion. Civilians also participated in support networks, including sewing uniforms, preparing supplies, and raising funds for relief efforts, highlighting the blurred lines between military and civilian spheres during the conflict. Northern civilians while largely shielded from direct combat, experienced the war's impact differently. The Union economy mobilized to sustain armies and supply campaigns, leading to shifts in labor, production, and daily life. Women entered factories, producing weapons, clothing, and other wartime goods, while families contended with rising food prices and inflation. Northern newspapers provided constant updates on battles and casualties, shaping public perception and morale and reinforcing the war's omnipresence even far from the front lines. African American communities, both free and enslaved, experienced transformative changes. For enslaved people in the South, the war presented both danger and opportunity. Escaping to Union lines provided freedom, while others remained on plantations or in occupied territories, navigating shifting allegiances and military authority. Freed people often contributed labor, intelligence, or guidance to Union forces, directly influencing campaigns and gaining a sense of agency previously denied under slavery. In conclusion, civilian life during the Civil War was defined by resilience, adaptation, and endurance. Families navigated disruption, scarcity, and danger, while women and African Americans assumed critical roles that reshaped social expectations and contributed to the war effort. The experience of civilians highlights the war's total nature, demonstrating that it was not solely a struggle of armies, but a transformative event affecting every aspect of American life. The Civil War had profound and lasting economic consequences, reshaping both the Northern and Southern economies and altering the trajectory of industrialization, agriculture, and labor systems. The conflict's scale, duration, and destruction created challenges and opportunities that influenced the post-war United States for decades. In the South, the war devastated traditional economic structures. The plantation system, built on enslaved labor, collapsed with emancipation, and much of the region's infrastructure, railroads, factories, and cities was destroyed by battles, raids, and campaigns like Sherman's March to the Sea. Agricultural production plummeted, leading to widespread food shortages and economic instability. Freed people, though legally emancipated, often became sharecroppers or tenant farmers, creating a labor system that perpetuated poverty and inequality while providing some continuity in agricultural output. The war's destruction meant that the South required decades of rebuilding to restore pre-war levels of economic activity. In contrast, the North experienced economic expansion fueled by wartime demand. Manufacturing, transportation, and finance industries grew rapidly to support Union armies. Factories produced weapons, uniforms, and supplies, while railroads transported troops and resources efficiently. Innovations in production and logistics accelerated industrialization, creating wealth and urban growth in the North. The federal government's use of bonds, tariffs, and taxes to fund the war also laid the foundation for modern fiscal policy and national banking systems. The war catalyzed technological and infrastructural investment. Railroads were expanded and standardized, telegraph networks were extended, and innovations in weaponry and logistics increased productivity. These developments not only supported military operations, but also set the stage for post-war industrial growth. Northern cities became hubs of economic activity, while southern cities, forced to rebuild, experienced slower recovery, but eventually integrated into a national economy increasingly dominated by industrial capital. Labor markets were also transformed. The departure of men to fight created opportunities for women in industry and service sectors, challenging traditional gender roles. In the South, freed people's transition from slavery to wage labor or sharecropping required adjustments in compensation, land ownership, and labor management, highlighting the war's profound social and economic ripple effects. In conclusion, the Civil War's economic impact was both destructive and transformative. The South faced devastation, labor reorganization, and long-term recovery challenges, while the North emerged economically stronger, industrialized, and more connected. These changes reshaped the nation's economic landscape, influencing patterns of growth, labor, and regional disparities well into the late 19th century. As we reach the close of our journey through the entire history of the American Civil War, it becomes clear that this conflict was far more than a series of battles, strategies, or political maneuvers. It was a defining moment that reshaped the nation, redefining freedom, citizenship, and the very concept of what it meant to be American. From the early tensions over slavery to the final surrender at Appomattox, every decision, every campaign, and every sacrifice contributed to the nation's transformation. The Civil War preserved the Union, proving that the United States could endure even the most profound internal divisions. It tested the strength of federal authority, ultimately confirming the supremacy of national unity over sectionalism. At the same time, the war brought an end to slavery, first through Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and finally through the ratification of the 13th Amendment. These milestones were not just legal achievements, they were moral and social revolutions that altered the lives of millions and laid the foundation for future struggles for equality and justice. The war also transformed military strategy and technology, from rifled muskets and artillery to ironclad ships and rail-based logistics. Innovations during the Civil War changed the face of warfare forever. Leaders like Grant, Lee, Sherman, and others demonstrated the profound impact of strategic planning, leadership, and adaptability, lessons that continue to inform military studies today. African American soldiers' courageous participation challenged existing social hierarchies and reshaped perceptions of citizenship and capability, while civilians' resilience and sacrifice highlighted the war's total and transformative nature. Economically and culturally, the war left the South devastated while accelerating industrial growth in the North, altering the nation's economic trajectory. Reconstruction and the subsequent amendments to the Constitution sought to address these transformations, even as challenges and inequalities persisted. Meanwhile, the memory and historiography of the war, including monuments, literature, and scholarship, shaped public understanding and collective identity for generations to come. Ultimately, the Civil War teaches enduring lessons about the costs of division, the necessity of moral leadership, and the resilience required to rebuild a nation. It reminds us that freedom, equality, and national unity are not inherited. They must be fought for, defended, and continually renewed. Its legacy lives on in the ongoing pursuit of justice, the understanding of history, and the recognition of the sacrifices that shaped the country we know today. Now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of the American Civil War and a deeper appreciation for the struggles, triumphs, and lessons of this defining chapter in history. Goodbye, dear friend. See you next time.